In this short video, we'll learn about the general workflow and working with Octane for Cinema 4D. Just setting Octane as your render engine, adding a light source, adding a camera, assigning basic materials to objects, previewing your render interactively in the live viewer, and a final render. This lesson is for the people who are just starting with rendering and really don't have the slightest idea what the process is like. If you have ever done any sort of rendering, you can safely skip this lesson. I suggest you watch anyways, as there will be some specific Octane points that could be useful. I have already created a few objects in my scene. I have a floor plane and a simple sphere on top of it. The first thing you need to do is to define Octane as your render engine, which we learned in the previous lesson. So in the render settings, change the render to Octane. Now let's create a light source. So from the Octane menu, open up the live viewer, and here from the objects menu, go to light and add an Octane area light. Now select the light, and from the details tab, change its height and width to 100 centimeters. And now you can position the light so it shines at our subject, which is this simple sphere. The next thing I want to do is to add a camera. Let's find a nice view for our render. This looks good enough for a first render. Now we need a camera to properly render our scene. So go back to the live viewer and add an Octane camera from the object menu, which creates a camera and snaps it to our perspective view. And now we can look at our scene through that Octane camera. Before rendering our scene, we need to also apply some materials to our objects. So open up the material manager. From the create menu, go to extensions, see for the Octane, and add a standard surface material. Rename it to sphere and assign it to the sphere. I'm just going to select the material, and in the attribute manager, go to the specular tab and zero out the specular weight. Now we have no reflections on the surface. Now let's duplicate the material, rename it to floor, and assign it to the floor. We can come back to these materials later on, but first let's see what we get from what we already have. Now we can start previewing our render and adjust our lights and materials as we see fit. In order to do that, we can open up Live Viewer again, adjust its size to fit our UI. Now we can start the render by clicking on the first icon here that says send your scene and restart a new render. And that is the render we get. So before adjusting our light or materials, I need to change a few default Octane settings. If I move the camera a bit to see beyond the floor plane, you notice there is this default white environment around the scene, which I don't like it and need to get rid of it, as I'd like to have specific control over the lighting in the scene. So let's open up the Octane settings window from the live viewer. Here, if I go to the settings tab and head over to the environment tab, I can change that default environment color from white to black so it wouldn't affect the lighting in our scene. Now let's get back to our original camera view again. We can use the same navigation hotkeys used in the viewport to move around in the live viewer as well. The next thing I like to adjust is the kernel being used. Octane uses direct lighting as the default kernel, which does not calculate indirect lighting or global illumination. So let's change the kernel to path tracing for more realistic lighting. Now we can start adjusting different parameters and see the result in real time, which is really helpful. So the first thing you'll notice is that the image is a bit too bright. Like in real life photography, we have two solutions. We can either decrease our light intensity or adjust the camera's exposure. For now, let's select the light and decrease its power to around 35, which gives us a better exposed render. We can adjust the power of the light to get what we want. I can still select the Octane camera tag, go to the camera imager tab, enable camera imager, and adjust the exposure to get a better exposed render. Now let's start working on our materials a bit. First, let's open up the sphere material and open up the node editor for the material. We can arrange these windows a bit better so we can see all of them. Now select the material itself, go to the base layer tab, increase the base or diffuse weight to 1. And also set the diffuse roughness to 0 because this is a smooth surface. We don't want a rough surface, and change the base to this bluish color with the RGB values of 82, 197, and 227. To make the sphere reflective, we can increase the specular weight to 1. Now let's select the floor material in the material manager, which loads it in the node editor. Here I want to use a texture to control the base color of the material. So let's add an image texture node from this left panel. And load this grid.png texture. And now connect the texture to the base color input of the material. And to fix the orientation of the texture, we can rotate the plane around 90 degrees on H. And that's it. Now we are ready for our final render. Let me close the node editor and the live viewer and open up the render settings. I think I'm going for a 1280 by 720 render. You can adjust the resolution as you like. Let's open up the Octane settings window again. The main parameter that controls the quality of your render is this max samples value. The lower it is, the faster and noisier the render, and the higher it is, the longer and cleaner it gets. By default, it's set to 16,000s when using path tracing, which is a lot for such a simple scene. Let's set it to around 2000s. Now we can start a final render in the picture viewer. And now the final render starts. Depending on your hardware, it can take a few seconds or a few minutes. And this render will take around 20 seconds on this machine. And here is our final render. It looks really clean. Yay! Our first render in Octane is done. Now we can save out this render from the file menu, choosing a proper output format like PNG or JPEG. Click OK. Choose where you want to save the file and name it properly. Then click on Save, and that's it. In this lesson, we learned about the general and very simplified workflow when using Octane as your render engine inside Cinema 4D, just to give you an idea of how things work. See you in the next one.